Mr. and Madam Speaker, side government values the work and effort and the bravery of these people who go out for having to pay for hazards. But we believe that in this situation, by giving them bonus in itself, actually distorts the real meaning of their work and their reputation itself. But secondly, since it leads to more further harms, as we're also going to explain in our second argument, we believe this motion should be proposed. So before going on to arguments, let us just talk about the definitions of this motion and what this policy is actually going to go for. So Mr. and Madam Speaker, what we mean by hazard pay is these people like investigators, or these people go in, like for example for Sewol Ferry, these people go into these ocean to find out these students in these ship, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We're talking about these people that actually go for the payment of these hazards. But secondly, what we mean by policy, so we're going to actually give, we're not going to give more money for these people who go and hazard pay, as we already explained in the definition, and we believe that also is not justified, as we're going to explain in our first argument. So we're going into arguments. In our first argument, we're going to bring the justifications and the real meaning of these hazard pay people, and why do they actually work for these in the first place. So I'm going to be explaining this into three main analyses. Firstly, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe that even in the status quo they give legitimate pay without the bonus. Why? Because we believe that even in the status quo we have certain criteria when these actually departments and when these people who do hazard pay have a certain criterion that they actually get payment for. They're not just getting a fixed payment when they actually get hired. We believe that these criterions actually fit in a particular way. That, for example, how much work they did, how many people they saved, or how many what work they did in the first place in that month. And that's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe these criterions already match the criteria upon these money that these people should get, and that's why we believe that the status quo with not giving the bonus in the first place is a very legitimate. But before I go on, yes, ma'am.
When it comes to national crisis, we think it's a really unique situation that's different from any other standard.
Mr. Madam Speaker, exactly. We're going to be proving in our further analysis. Firstly, how it's a very arbitrary standard upon differentiating between natural disasters. We're also going to be telling you how these hazards and how these burdens do not increase just because it's a natural situation. But for the sake of this argument, I'd like to firstly continue on what I have been explaining. So, Mr. Madam Speaker, we already believe that these people have a legitimate pay in the status quo. That's why we believe giving a bonus in itself is very not justified. Thank you, sir. In this situation, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speaker, we believe that does not match the focus of these people, and that's why we say there's no problem in the status quo without giving these bonuses. But having that clarified, I'd like to go to our team's second analysis. Our second analysis upon, thank you, sir, on how it's their work, how the characteristics of these people who do hazard pay. Firstly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe that these people who do hazard pay actually do a lot of study. They actually put a lot of effort in their when they're students to go to these schools or tests to become hazard pay. And that's why, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speaker, they don't go for a work that gives more pay, but they actually value more reputation. They actually value more efforts that they actually put in and being a very big and a role model for our society. That's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, even though the pay itself is relatively small for these hazard payers, they actually try to do this because of the bravery, because of the reputation that they get in the end of the day. Well, thank you, ma'am. I already took your PY. And that's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, in this situation, we believe that these people, it's distorting their work in the first place because they do for reputation. By giving this back as money, no, thank you, sir. By giving them back for this money, we believe that's actually undermining their effort when their effort was for reputation. By giving it back by money, we believe that's undermining and firstly distorting the real justification of why these people work as hazard payers in the first place. And that's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe it's distorting the meaning, and that goes over the justification. But going on to the third analysis, which is also the response to PY that the opposition team has talked about. Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe that firstly, we believe that there is a proportional burden that these people get in particular situations. Why? Because if it's a national crisis, if it's a really, really big natural disaster like Sewol Ferry incident, we pick more people to go to these hazard payers. We make more people of hazard payers to go to these situations, go to these things to actually clear out that situation. And that is why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, the proportional burden that they get itself is same from every single other situation that we find in the status quo, even though it's not a natural disaster in the first place. And that's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, since it's not a situation where these hazard payers need to pay more work, these hazard payers have more risk of dying in the first place, we believe that is clearly justified to give the legitimate pay that we already give in the status quo without the bonuses. That's why, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe that since the burden itself is not it's also the criterion, since that is the same factor that we find in the status quo, we don't see any justification about giving them more bonuses in this case. But secondly, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we believe that the characteristics of these people who do hazard pay itself actually promotes and actually gives them risk for every single time of their work. It's not that even only in natural disasters they have more harm, they have more risk. We believe that since every single time of their work on their duty itself is a harm, we believe that's a very arbitrary standard that we see from their opposition to only give up on these natural disasters. And that's why in our first argument, Mr. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, we'd say it's unjustified. It goes over and distorts the real meaning of these people working as hazard payers. Having to clarify that, I'd like to go to our team's second argument. Mr. Madam Speaker, our second argument is about how it leads to further harms upon this case. Why? Because we believe that the market principle actually believes that people and also like these occupations should get the work from what they did. And that's why, Madam Speaker, in our first argument, as we successfully proved to you, how these people get the amount of legitimate payment as they also did as a hazard payer. We believe that that leads to more further harms by giving harms to the economy. Why? Because when it comes to the uniqueness of these natural disasters, government needs to pay for a lot of other things. By recovering the situation, the cover up the disaster, they need to also pay and give back the payment for the victims that were affected by this policy and affected by the natural disaster. In this situation, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe that there are a lot of economic and financial constraints for the government. If these people who actually go for bravery and for reputation for this government and for the citizens itself, when they actually go and demand the government for more money, that leads to a situation where government needs to also use their resources upon situations where giving them money to these hazard payers. And we believe that's very exactly going over the market principle also. But that leads to a burden for these governments to actually not giving and using resources when they really, really needed to actually cover up the disaster and give payment for the victims in the first place. And that's why, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe firstly they distort the criminal principle, and secondly, since that goes over further harms, we believe that we strongly oppose this motion.
Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that is really different when one person organizes a small car accident and 100 people organizes the accident of Sewol incident, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that itself, the harm is significantly different, and this is why we strongly support the motion that we grant the demands for hazard pay during disaster, Mr. Madam Speaker. Before I move on to the wonderful arguments, we were both for the previous speaker. Firstly, they talked about the justification. Firstly, they told us that they already have legitimate pay. They talked about these kind of weird criteria that they never put specifically about, Mr. Madam Speaker. Firstly, we think that in these cases where this kind of disaster is really, really big, we think that it's not criteria that is already existing in status quo. It's not unpredictable criteria that's creating in today's status quo in these kind of situations, Mr. Madam Speaker. But secondly, they talked about these kind of characteristics where they put a lot of effort, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that that's the exact reason why they need more pay. They need more compensation because they had a lot of effort on doing that, Mr. Madam Speaker. Under your logic, why do you pay firefighters more than other public fighters, Mr. Madam Speaker? We think that this is because you respect them from doing having that risk in the first thing, Mr. Madam Speaker. And then they go on and talk about the market principle. Firstly, that's really unjust because you don't go on and check these kind of how much you're going to pay employees based upon market principle, Mr. Madam Speaker. It has to purely be based upon how much compensation you have to give these people based on what they did, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that that is justifiable under their style, Mr. Madam Speaker. But second of all, we also tell you that these people are not going to the government and demanding for more pay, but we're simply giving them more compensation for the respect of what they did, Mr. Madam Speaker. And today we have a lot to prove to you. So directly moving on to our team's arguments. Firstly, we're going to prove to you what exactly is a disaster. Secondly, we're going to tell you about why in this case it's justified to pay more money for these people. Thirdly, we're going to talk about government responsibility. Firstly, about what is a disaster. Mr. Madam Speaker, think about national crisis. We go and talk about hurricanes like Hurricane Katrina, Sewol, and Sewol, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that the similarity of these kind of big incidents is that they really have a large size to begin with, and it influences a lot of people with a lot of harm causing, Mr. Madam Speaker. It's really exclusive when it comes to the size and amount of harm where these disasters cause to society in the first thing, Mr. Madam Speaker. And then we're going to secondly prove to you why in this case it's justified to pay more money. But before I go on, yes.
Even though size in itself is very big, if we prove to you how the proportional burden that every single individual gets in natural disasters are the same.
We think that logic itself is really wrong in the first place, Mr. Madam Speaker. We're going to further talk about why these people are really, really harmed in these kind of situations where it's actually a disaster, a national crisis. To begin with, Mr. Madam Speaker, so their logic that many people, if there were many people in Sewol accidents, really they have the same labor amount as one person cleaning up of the ground, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that itself is a really unjust logic coming from their side. So directly moving on to your team's second argument, why in this case it's justified to pay more money to these people. We have three standards to provide you. When do we pay more for these people? Firstly, when you have a high risk of risking your life or risking your health problem, Mr. Madam Speaker. For example, we pay more to firefighters compared to other public servants, Mr. Madam Speaker, because they come to risk their lives and risk their health, Mr. Madam Speaker. And why is this a high risk situation? situation. We think that when it comes to national, especially natural disaster, Mr. Madam Speaker, there are existing following disasters. There are high possibility for following disasters to happen, Mr. Madam Speaker. That is exactly why the potential of you getting harmed is actually significantly increasing these kind of cases, Mr. Madam Speaker. But furthermore, we already talked about how the uniqueness of national crisis, why it's really different from one car accident happening in one kind of town, Mr. Madam Speaker. When it comes to a situation where you have leakage of oil, or you have Sewol incident, all these stuff, Mr. Madam Speaker, that is why there is a high risk of these people, and that is why we're justified to pay them more. But secondly, more importantly, we tell you that when you do more labor or more work, we pay them more. So, for example, if you work after 10 o'clock p.m., we pay them more money. It's for the compensation for what they did, Mr. Madam Speaker. Why do they give? Why do they have more labor? We think that when it comes to these situations, they have extensive amount of labor because in these situations it takes a long time. The searching process takes a really long time. Danger, and effort in the first place, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why they provide more labor, they provide more effort in order to solve these kind of issues. When it comes to natural disaster, when it comes to national crisis, Mr. Madam Speaker. For example, in Sewol, divers were physically harmed because of too much exposure to water. It was dangerous environment, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why they provide more labor, more effort. And thirdly, when it actually comes to harming these individuals, such as in military, we pay these people more because they have possibility to harm themselves, Mr. Madam Speaker. Why is these people harmed in national crisis? We think that they're traumatized. They see people dying in front of their eyes. They have to search for dead bodies and see, Mr. Madam Speaker. I think that psychological harm is huge in this debate, Mr. Madam Speaker. That is exactly why we are more than justified to actually pay them more money. But secondly, we also want to prove to you why it's government responsibility. We think that it's government responsibility to promote security. We have social contract with people, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that when it comes to government obligation, we cannot shirk responsibility to other people, Mr. Madam Speaker. So when individual and other factors cannot deal with these kind of huge crises, national crisis in the first place, it's the government's job, government's duty to protect people's security according to the social contract, Mr. Madam Speaker. And we think that if we don't have a lot of natural incentive in the first place in today's debate, Mr. Madam Speaker, as I proved to you in our second argument, people don't have natural incentive to go in that areas because we think that they are so high risk and they have such a lot of dangers and effort, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why we think that we have to provide incentive. We have to have these kind of government intervening so that we have to so that we can save more people, so that we can provide better security for the people, Mr. Madam Speaker. We think that that's absolute government responsibility, and that's why we're more than positive.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if we clearly summarize up what the last speaker of the opposition side said for the last 6 minutes, they talked about how these people risk their lives. They talked about how these people do more labor. Well, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that if that is the case, we think that these kind of things are already corrected into their pay in the first place, because the characteristic of hazard workers itself is the characteristic that they have to risk their lives in order to save someone, Mr. Madam Speaker. And that is why we think that the legitimate pay that we give to them is something that actually considers all of those factors that you already talked about. But Mr. Madam Speaker, what we want to say in this debate today is that we don't have to give someone this person cannot demand the government in order to give them a privilege, because the right to compensation is not a right by itself. It is a privilege that these people ask for. And we think that if this is the situation where also this nation is going through economic crisis, we think that this is also a justification in order to say that these people might not be given that privilege because of that factor. But having that said, before moving on to our team's third argument, let me rebut to the previous speaker. First of all, they talked about how this is not justification because in this case, the disaster is really, really big and we don't have the predictable factors. But as we talked about before, hazard workers always risk their lives, and currently that is considered into the payment of their job, and that is a characteristic of job that we cannot deny, Mr. Madam Speaker. So we think that they have done this job, so they should give them the legitimate pay. But Mr. Madam Speaker, although we're sorry to say that, we don't think that they have the right to tell us to give them a more privilege. But secondly, let's look at the words that they looked at. So first speaker actually came up and admitted that this is not a legitimate pay, this is a compensation. Well, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that maybe because they didn't describe it as pay, we think that compensation itself is probably is actually a privilege that these people should get. So they should prove to us why this is an innate right of these people in the first place. And then they gave us an example of firefighters and how these people get higher pay than others. First of all, no, we deny that premise in the first place, these people don't get like higher pay. But secondly, but even if that is true, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that this also is because this includes the factor that these firefighters risk their lives in order to like save these kind of people. We think that because of that, these firefighters' wages are probably high. And that is why I think that these kind of factors are already considered in the status for Mr. and Madam Speaker. So then they talked about how hazard workers do more work. First of all, we don't think that it's not like we ask them to do extra work. We hire more people in order to clean up for all the natural disasters. But Mr. and Madam Speaker, we don't think that there is like more work that we ask them to do in the first place. But secondly, we don't know, how do you know if they do more effort or more labor in the first place? We don't know if these people actually do more labor or not. So we think that this can't be used as a standard in order to say that these people deserve more pay, more like compensation for this privilege or not. But Mr. and Madam Speaker, we also want to think about this like trade-off, and we want to look at this economic situation of the government. Mr. and Madam Speaker, when disasters happen, government has to go and they recover for that. And Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that that budget itself is fixed. And we think that in this situation, if we give more pay to these kind of workers, this means naturally that these kind of budget that is given to these kind of recoverers, or like the safety problems that they talked about, is going to decrease. And Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that when there is that harm, and also this is a special situation, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that in that case they can't really demand for a privilege. So then they talked about how there's no natural incentive to come. Mr. Speaker, we think that we do have good people in society, not like opposition, but we think that there are good people in society that also want to work for this because of their reputation, because this is the fact. It is the fact that these people's pay are not like so high in the first place. I know First Speaker already clearly explained to you how there is an incentive for these people to work because of the reputation and all of the other things that they are given. We heard no response whatsoever from the opposition. So we think that we have proven to you how their policy has no justification, or like no justification in the first place, and they already have the harms. But let me go into the third argument, which is about the specifics as to how this distorts the meaning of hazard workers, and also about how these workers are not going to be these diligent workers that we want. So, Mr. Speaker, we like these people. We like these people's brave actions, and we want them to be recognized by the society. But what we also worry about is that citizens will view these people as people who work for money. And since they get the bonus, the work they do for us is something that should be given. And this is what the citizens will think, because we're like getting that budget from somewhere else. So, Mr. Speaker and Madam Speaker, we think that there are some people who work for these positions because of reputation and the respect that they're given when they do these kind of hazard workers. So these people don't have the incentive to do so under opposition policy that doesn't guarantee them the reputation or or doesn't respect them for the bravery that they have been doing so far. So, Mr. and Madam Speaker, for these kind of reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, we heard a major consensus, concession coming from the first speaker of the government, because their PM told us that this money that these kind of workers get is relatively small. And I was happy to say that we're debating under the same premise that this kind of workers getting this much pay is relatively small compared to the money and compared to the work they do and contribution they make to actually solving this kind of national crisis and solving this kind of accidents that happen in the society, Mr. Madam Speaker. This means that they agree to the fact that this kind of compensation is not proportionate to begin with, and that's why we already take today's debate home. Having said that, let's go on and rebut what the previous speakers have talked about. Firstly, they talked about this ridiculous logic about how it distorts the meaning of these workers. Well, two responses. First, Mr. Madam Speaker, just because you have meaning doesn't mean you have the legitimacy to give you relatively small pay to begin with. Because, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that when it comes to firefighters or doctors, we say that any job has this really, really sacred meaning to begin with. Mr. Madam Speaker, it doesn't mean that you can give them less money. And if you really, really value this kind of meaning, Mr. Madam Speaker, then you should have volunteer jobs, not pay this person in the first place. It's the meaning, it's the first priority that you consider. And second, Mr. Madam Speaker, we say that these kind of things are exploitation because it's different from you being a good person, because it's getting a fair compensation for the work that you did. And that's something that's fair, not related to morality or the meaning that you have in working for this kind of crisis situations. Thirdly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that giving them more money and it actually increases and higher the legitimacy and the sacred meaning of their work as well. Because, Mr. Madam Speaker, value of job in the society is often decided by the more money that you give and pay to these kind of workers to begin with, and that's why you have to give them fair compensation. And Mr. Madam Speaker, like you said, if these people value this meaning so much, then these people wouldn't demand more pay to begin with. Well, the fact that these people demand more pay in the status quo means that these people don't there should be an additional standard apart from the other standards that they have given us. Because, Mr. Madam Speaker, we gave you that this situation is even more unique than the situation that they provided us. Why? Because the reason why we differentiate national crisis from any other accidents, because it's really, really unique. We told you that this job is prolonged than the fact that it was first designed to be. It's more prolonged job. And secondly, we talked about this national and public mood that these people have is also influenced in these kind of disasters. Because when it comes to Sewol ferries, many people were angered about the situation, and that's why they demanded these workers to work harder, prolonged job. And because of this natural checks and balance, they were forced to have more risks, forced to have prolonged job, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why the situation is so unique, different from other accidents and other differences, because they shed more light, media attention, and citizens' attention on these kind of issues. And that's why these workers are forced to have more risk under this case. And that's why the money that we already give them is not a fair compensation to begin with. Secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, under our model, we can hire higher quality workers who have more professionalities in these kind of subjects. Because if we pay more, there's more incentive for people, professional people to come in. And that's why we can have more effective actually searches in these kind of national crises. And that's why we can have more effective solutions for these kind of crises. For lastly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we told you that these kind of accidents, solving these kind of accidents are prolonged and it was planned to be. And that's why, Mr. Madam Speaker, there's full justification for government in this case to give them more money than other standards. And that's why there should be an additional criteria apart from the other standard that they have given us in today's debate. Lastly, let's go on about their point about how to harm the economy. Two responses. First, Mr. Madam Speaker, we say it's still the government's responsibility under the social contract to solve this kind of crisis, because the government under the social contract, government has to solve situations that individuals cannot solve. And this is exactly such a situation, Mr. Madam Speaker. And the fact that government doesn't have money, so that's why they can't give them, means that corporations don't have money, so they can give their workers pay under the minimum wage because they just don't have money. They should not be a justification for them to give unfair compensation for these kind of workers, Mr. Madam Speaker. Government should put more funds in these kind of national crises or do other things and give them a fair compensation, because unless they do that, it's merely an exploitation of their labor. And we say the government should not be the one who's doing this kind of immoral actions and actually actively participating in this kind of immoral action of giving unfair compensation for these workers who work really, really hard, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why their point never stand and none of them stand in today's debate. Having said that, let's go on for our last argument, which is about our policy actually satisfies the public more in today's debate. Mr. Madam Speaker, when it comes to these kind of natural disasters, the responsibility is tilted towards the government, and that's why the public blame the government a lot, and that's why the public gives a lot of criticism to the government in these cases, and that's why there's been a lot of media attention issues and natural checks and balance issues in these kind of cases. For example, when it comes to Sewol Ferry incident, it was the same case as well. In this case, government has to go in line with the public demands. Public demand that this crisis to be solved in an efficient manner, and government has to do that by providing them with fair compensation and giving them effective searches. And that can be only done when they give them fair compensation and more money and grant the demand of these workers, because these workers think that the compensation that they're getting in the status quo is not enough. And in that case, we say the government has full responsibility to go in line with this kind of demand that public makes. And secondly, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think this is an extension of government responsibility, and providing them with more compensation is the only method that's fair and humane to these kind of workers who take really, really big risks when they're going on to this going on in solving this kind of national crisis situation. Because, Mr. Madam Speaker, we proved to you why there should be an additional standard apart from the standard that they have given us in today's debate. We already take this debate home.
Mr. and Madam Speakers, we consider bonuses as a privilege. When they say that bonuses should actually be the correct compensation, we say that that simply doesn't stand because they never rebutted to any of our points, saying that when the scale of the disaster is actually bigger, we actually send more people there. And firstly, we believe that there was a logical leap in explaining to us why if the harm is big, the amount of labor is also big, because we also told you how we're going to send more people if the scale of the disaster is actually big. So tell us what exclusivity this disaster is actually holds. But secondly, Mr. and Madam Speakers, we say that another flaw of team opposition was that they asked us, the second speaker asked us why, our first speaker explained the cost of and the payment of these firefighters as relatively small. Mr. and Madam Speakers, we say that they never understood our point, because the only reason we said that is because you may consider the amount relatively small, but that really wasn't our point. But secondly, we say that already in the current status quo, these laborers actually consent to and concede to to the amount of pay that they actually receive in the current status quo. If they were willing to receive bonuses as a correct compensation for their work, Mr. and Madam Speakers, we say that they would have never opted into that job in the first place. But thirdly, we say that they have never given any rebuttals to one of our severe harms, many of our severe harms, especially regarding the part about how this can lead to more disasters in the future. We want the next speaker to please clarify that. But number 4, one of their major flaws in their whole case was that they had no benefits, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We please want the next speaker to please clarify that. And for these reasons, we say that even if the op reply grants out all the rebuttals, team opposition can never win this debate. Let me directly go upon the first clash regarding the justification. Mr. and Madam Speakers, we told you how the only difference between disasters and regular accidents is the scale. But then we also told you that if the scale gets big, we send more agents. And that's why, even if the harm increases, the amount of labor one actually doesn't increase. And therefore, we say that we consider the status quo's policy and pay already include such consequences into account. That's why these laborers opted into that job in the first place, because they can never consider that extra bonus as the reason for they can never expect that extra bonus justifiably. But then they told us that the harm is extremely different. Well, firstly, we already told you how we pay more people when the scale is fixed. So them saying this means that they actually value the price of lives differently, regardless of the number, because we already rebutted to that number how we're going to send more people. So therefore, we said that their stance actually sends out a very immoral message. How if you died in a natural disaster, your life is more valuable than those if you died of a car accident. We say that that's extremely immoral. But then they also told us, the first speaker told us how the firefighters are actually paid more, Mr. and Madam Speaker. Exactly. That's the reason why we say the government actually puts that criterion of hazard pay already into account in the current status quo. But then they also told us how disasters actually follow disasters. That's the exact reason why we believe that we should actually propose today's motion. Because the ultimate duty of the government is to protect its citizens, and that's why we believe that this motion actually exists in the first place. But if you think that disasters actually follow disasters, the correct government's duty would actually be to place that government budget into solving so that extra disasters won't actually happen. That's the exact reason why we need to implement our policy instead of paying these people. Because if we spend the budget upon these conflicts, upon these people, we say that the amount of budget that can be spent to clear up such disasters actually decrease. We want the next speaker to clearly rebut to that. But then they also gave us an example of soldiers. Mr. and Madam Speakers, we do not give bonuses for soldiers regardless of their work or their situation, and that's because we believe that they have actually opted in and conceded to all the harms and decided on his or her job, Mr. and Madam Speaker. Therefore, tell us an exclusive benefit opposition when even its laborers actually opted into the current status quo and says that the current status quo is justified. If they wanted that bonus, and if they think that the current pay is not enough, they would have never opted in to become such firefighters in the first place. But then they said that these people actually demand more money in the current status quo. Mr. and Madam Speaker, we say that that's unfair characterization, because if there are people who demand more money and refuse to work without that extra bonus, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we say that they're never qualified to be firefighters in the first place. But because the reason why we pay these people, the reason why we value these workers in the first place, is because we consider their sacrifice, them sacrificing their life, even if they might die, them still working to save these people itself is extremely valuable. That's a value we have upon these workers in the first place. So if you think that they're not going to work unless we give them a bonus, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we say that itself means that they're not willing to sacrifice their own lives unless you give them more money, Mr. and Madam Speaker. Therefore, we say that these people aren't qualified in the first place, and therefore we consider the quality of these people more important. But more importantly, Mr. and Madam Speaker, we say that this can lead to an unfair and extremely immoral social message where if you don't receive a bonus, you don't actually have to work that hard enough, Mr. and Madam Speaker. We say that that's extremely immoral considering the actual jobs of these firefighters, of these policemen in the first place. Therefore, for all these reasons, we believe that we have won the first clash regarding whether the government actually has justification or not. But secondly, let me go directly upon the second clash regarding the harms and benefits. That the second speaker actually told us, when we told you the thing about reputation in the first place, they told us that why don't they work without money? That's the only response we actually received. The answer is simple, Mr. and Madam Speaker, because if they want to work that as a job, they need money in order to continue on with their lives, continue on with their jobs. We do not see why that was a rebuttal in the first place. But secondly, we still say that there are people who don't work with payments, so we believe that enough answer was given to that. But then suddenly their third argument is that because they have more responsibility, they should actually receive more payments. We already denied that premise because we told you how we're going to send more agents regarding the scale, Mr. and Madam Speaker. So simply saying that more responsibility exists because the harm is bigger is a huge logical leap. And therefore we say that this is no different from any other activity in the first place. Mr. and Madam Speakers, what did we tell you in today's debate? We told you how we won both clashes, and we told you how team composition never has an exclusive benefit. They simply say that such kind of extra bonus is a regular compensation, Mr. Speaker. But if that was true, why would these laborers actually opt into their job in the current status quo? For these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we thought it was very inconsistent for government to say that at the same time they didn't want to demean the efforts of these individuals who sacrificed their lives into saving these people, and at the same time saying that they want to pay them less, Mr. Speaker. Our deputy clearly pointed out in this debate that the more you get paid, the more value you put into that job. We gave you examples of doctors. Because they save lives, they get a lot of pay. And that was never engaged upon by government whip in this debate, therefore we're very proud to oppose. I'm going to talk about 3 things in this debate. First, is their policy justified in the context of government obligation? Second, do they value or demean the effort of these people, of these savers? And thirdly, who better solves the issue and deals with the problem of natural disasters and disasters as a whole, Mr. Speaker? Without further ado, I'd like to move on to the first clash. Is their policy justified? Now, I'm going to ask 2 questions in this debate. Firstly, whether there's a difference in labor and psychological harm that these savers have compared to disasters and other accidents. They told you 3 things. Firstly, he told you that the labor is divided to 100 people. Therefore, it's not big labor. And that's what government will repeat it for 3 minutes, right? Firstly, we think that regardless of whether it's divided to 100 people, we told you there are exclusive harms that happen because it's a disaster. Every day you have to opt in and walk into a situation where you see buildings being destroyed, bloods everywhere. In cases of natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, Madam Speaker, we also point you to the case of Sewol, where every day you opt in and go into the cold ocean, and your hands actually become fatter because of that physical, because of the influence of salt water. Every day you see another child being dead and being up in the water, Mrs. Speaker. We did that psychological harm was significant regardless of how many people were there, which we are no engagement upon whatsoever in this debate from side proposition. But secondly, we think that there's also difference in labor. We compare the situation where there's one car accident and people start to solve that versus people who opt into Sewol incident. We think that regardless of whether there is whether there are more people or not, we think that still comparatively, we think that opting into Sewol, solving Hurricane Katrina has longer labor, Mr. Speaker, because Sewol incident, you needed to do that saving project for 3 months, while for comparatively for other fires or other accidents, it comparatively lasts for only a few weeks. And that we thought that quantity and the length of the labor you do was quantitatively different, and we heard no refutation against that. And our characterization was much more likely in this debate, because our deputy speaker clearly talked about whether it's a public demand. When there's a Sewol incident, people demand for people to opt into this and work as hard as possible because it's so much of a devastating accident. And that's why we thought that these people had a higher possibility. It was more likely if they opted into labor and did more harder labor, and we thought that idea was never engaged whatsoever by government whip in this debate. That was very, very problematic. Second thing he talked about under this class was about how it's already considered before you go into the accident. We think, Madam Speaker, we can't expect everything beforehand. We think that in many of these cases, these disasters, the saving project lasts more than what you expected. The Sewol incident lasted for 3 months, Mrs. Speaker, and because the government cannot do this, we think that when they work harder and when they work longer than expected and longer than paid, we think that they should get more bonuses for that. And that idea we thought was very, very important in this debate. Their idea of how it's already all considered didn't make sense because they didn't always know about how much length you'll be in that serious in that accident, how serious the situation was before going into there. That's why we thought that giving bonuses when that pay was inaccurate before was better, quantitatively better for these people. Thirdly, the told you it's not exclusive because other workers do the same thing. Before that, go.
Tell me when people actually opt into these situations.
I'll live about that further in my clash. So 2 responses towards not exclusive. Firstly, we think that it's more extensive, Mrs. Speaker, because you already proved to you why it's longer and about how on how it's all about how more serious the situation is. Secondly, we already talked about psychological damage towards it's clearly brought up by a leader of opposition, which we are no response whatsoever. And that's why the degree of labor was different. Sewol incident was obviously more severe in degree compared to one accident or car accident, Mrs. Speaker. Let's then look at the second question under the same clash, government responsibility. They told you 2 things. Firstly, people consented to that. We think, Madam Speaker, when there's an employer and employee relationship, there's always a power imbalance situation. And when it comes to these saving project people, these disasters don't happen every day. That's why it's really hard for these people to find jobs in frequently, right? That's why they really need to work there. That's why they would be in a power imbalance situation to lower their wages, and we thought that was problematic. And in that same line, we have minimum wages for other corporations as well. And this idea was brought up by our DLO in this debate, which we heard no refutation against. But secondly, he told you this policy is economically better for the government. Firstly, we think that's shirking responsibility, Mrs. Speaker. We think that companies don't have a right to violate minimum wage laws because it benefits their profit. But secondly, we think that when they don't get bonuses, it's undercompensating. That's harmful. Let's move on to second class very briefly. Value and the meaning of their effort. They told you we would demean efforts of these people under our model. Firstly, we think that is actually the opposite, because the more utility you provide to society, the more pay you deserve. That's a social consensus under the market principle that the Prime Minister argued in this debate. But secondly, we think that that's true. People will voluntarily reject those pays to begin with, but that's not happening in status quo, which proves that they need money to sustain lives, and they need to sustain their households, they need food to live, they need houses to pay, Mr. Speaker. And that's why for them to not receive economic difficulties, money was needed, and that's why we valued welfare better. Thirdly, better solvency, Mr. Speaker. We told you in our second to third exam, that's why less people will come, and less people, professionality will come. They told you people are moral, and therefore will come anyways. Yes, they're moral, but when their work is demeaned, we think that's problematic. When they work, and they have to opt in, when they have to force them into going to every disaster every single day, and all they get is not enough money that cannot even sustain their households, they feel it's unfair, and they have less incentive to opt into that. And it wasn't a bad message you're talking about, it's a market principle that Prime Minister led. They told you they're going to promote for better money to solve disasters. We think it's government's responsibility to allocate budget efficiently to solve the problem, not pushing the burden towards these workers who are actually trying. You know, it's the government's responsibility to take care of the budget. They shouldn't force these people, force these workers to be responsible for government failure and say that because we don't have money, we're not going to give these people adequate pay. All in all, we're very proud to post, and the motion was called. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, today we saw government demanding us what's the uniqueness of this job, what's the uniqueness of this job, and that's what they said for 18 minutes of their speech. Well, Madam Speaker, we already responded from our leader of opposition speech why this is unique. We gave you, Madam Speaker, the public anger of this innocent soul that died in Sewol Ferry incident was really, really big, and that's why these kind of investigators were forced to go more deeper into the water, take more risk, prolong searches, Madam Speaker, and that's why in this case, when they take more risk and have more risk, Madam Speaker, when they have the sacred job of saving more people, Madam Speaker, we say that they're really immoral people who do not give fair justification, fair compensation for these people who are working really, really hard to save innocent souls of Sewol Ferry incident, Madam Speaker. That's why we take today's debate home. Having said that, let's go on and identify the clashes of today's debate. Firstly, it was about fair compensation. Firstly, Madam Speaker, they talked about how it's extra bonus, there's no difference with other jobs. Well, firstly, Madam Speaker, we clearly characterized to you why this was a unique situation. Apart from the fact about the national and public mood, we gave you that there's a lot of psychological and physical damage that when it comes to searching in these kind of Sewol Ferry incidents to go in the first place. Because it's national crisis, there's a lot of prolonged jobs, and that's why you have many physical and psychological damages. And it's the obligation of the government to actually give fair compensation in this case. Secondly, Madam Speaker, if they did receive fair compensation, then why would they demand more to begin with? If these are people really, really moral, like they characterize Madam Speaker, why would they demand more money? The answer is because the money that they get in the current status quo is not enough. And if that's the case, it's really, really problematic. And this point was never responded by their side either. Madam Speaker, even if you opt in, we say that this wasn't an informed choice to begin with because you didn't know that this would be more prolonged. You didn't get the psychological and physical damages before you actually started investigating to begin with, and that's why because you opted in should not be a justification in this case. Second point was about who provides a better solvency. First, Madam Speaker, they talked about provide us a solvency for the situation and what's your benefit, and that's what the government whip talked about for the 6 minutes of her speech. But Madam Speaker, we gave you this kind of benefit. We told you that we can have better quality searches, better quality professional in these kind of areas, Madam Speaker. But this point was also not responded by their side. Second, Madam Speaker, they talked about the harms to the economy. They talked about how because the government doesn't have money, we won't give you money. But Madam Speaker, we don't justify corporation not giving you enough and fair compensation for your job because corporation doesn't have money. Same logic. Government shouldn't not just give money because they don't have money. This is not a fair, legitimate justification, Madam Speaker. And this point was completely dropped by their side at the end of today's debate as well, because they realized at the end of today's debate how this was a really, really weak point that they cannot actually prove. And that's why we also take this point home as
Mr. Madam Speaker, let us open the sweet box of rhetoric that the opposition has provided to us and see the rotten content inside. We believe that the opposition in itself was too hasty upon giving us the rebuttals, and they actually debating off the premise that we are giving less payment for these people who are hazard payers. We believe that in the first place, we already told you the legitimacy of the status quo, even without bonuses in the first place. And we already told you that even every single occupation do not have the innate right for you to get a privilege, which is a bonus, right? The bonus in itself meaning it's that you get additional pay. In this additional pay, Mr. Madam Speaker, that means you get a privilege in itself. And since they told us the only uniqueness that they talked about is that they uphold the sacred meaning in itself, we believe that they fail to prove to us their biggest burden. Why? Because first, Mr. Madam Speaker, yes, these people do actually complete and uphold the very sacred meaning of saving these people. Under that context, even if another businessman also have a sacred meaning of upholding the economy, right? Because if they don't have the economy, then people will die because they don't have money, right? In this situation, Mr. Madam Speaker, their logic can apply to any other situation. They never prove us why they're so unique in this situation. But secondly, even though we say that we also agree and value the effort that these people actually are brave enough to actually go and actually save these people in the first place, we already told you the global, even though the scale in itself is big, when we have a lot of people in itself, then we can also decrease the burden that every single individual gives. What response that we got from the opposition? The opposition told us that just because, since it's a global scale, and since it's a very, very big scale, this burden does not decrease. But Mr. Madam Speaker, let me give you a very familiar example. So if I'm a burden, like if I'm a hazard payer for the Sewol Ferry incident, and if I'm like diver to go and like get out of these like students and get out like their body, in the situation, Mr. Madam Speaker, in this situation, if we have less payers, if we have less of these hazard payers, then I need to go to the water for 5 hours. But if we have more people, Mr. Madam Speaker, that means I can only go to the water for 1 hour. In this situation, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe that the physical burden that you get in itself decreases. But when it comes to psychological harms, that came out from the opposition with, right? That was too late for them to talk about the psychological harms. But in itself, Mr. Madam Speaker, even though we do consent that we do have psychological harms, our previous speakers already told you how that psychological harm were already consented, and even though you cannot predict the future natural disasters, the meaning that you opt into that actually, you opt into becoming a hazard payer in itself told you that you already knew the risk, you already knew the potential of getting psychological harms and physical harms. That's why we say that's not a benefit, that's not a justification for them to prove those. But secondly, we already told you that there is a legitimacy because we put into criterions upon how many work did you do. And also, Mr. Madam Speaker, our second speaker already told you a hazard payer is a very flexible job. There is no kind of like the fixed legitimate pay. Like for example, in companies, if you go over like 6 hours, working 6 hours, then you may get a bonus. But for these hazard payers, Mr. Madam Speaker, we already told you that these people have a very flexible job upon there is no set labor, and that's why there is an arbitrary standard upon giving more labor, having more work for these people, and that's why we told you in the first place it's very arbitrary, it's also wrong. But also, secondly, we already told you that we go for better quality of these people by sending a social message that these people do go for reputation. But what we heard from the opposition was a very ridiculous example for how these people do not work for reputation. If their people work for reputation, they won't demand for money. But Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe that when they talk about how we give them an amount of payment that they can never sustain their family in the first place, that's under the premise that we give them lesser punishment, but lesser payment. But if it's not that premise, Mr. Madam Speaker, we firstly tell you we are better justified because we give them the legitimate payment, but secondly, we already told you the significant and physical harms that happen under their policy, and that's why we strongly propose this.